All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mom's Corner. I hope everyone's doing well today. My name is Zainab, your host, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And before we proceed and before I forget, I want to remind everyone that, as promised, we will issue the stipends shortly, and I will drop the link to that in the chat box for those in attendance today. For those who are regulars on Mom's Corner, thank you for being here. And for those who are joining us for the first time, welcome and thank you. And a big thank you to our amazing guests today for being here. Mom's Corner is one of the many umbrellas under one of the many programs under the umbrella of Global Palliative Services, or GPS. And GPS is a nonprofit organization doing amazing work and changing lives every day. Our mission is to provide community-based doula services that will educate, respect, and empower low-income Black, refugee, and immigrant women and their families during pregnancy, birth, and into early parenting. Mom's Corner is a space not just for moms, but for all women folk, because at GPS, we believe that motherhood is an extension of a woman's identity and not the definition. Mom's Corner, since the pandemic, has become not just a space where we come to find empathy, support, and camaraderie, but a safe haven and access to so many critical resources in our communities. Our topic for today is genetic counseling and genetic testing, and I'm so excited to hear all about it, as I'm sure all of you are. Brief bio of our guest, Brenna Boyd. Brenna is a current genetic counseling student at the University of Washington, and she's graduating in March. Go Huskies. She previously worked in rare disease research and autism research at the University of Washington and has a background in psychology. Brenna lives in Seattle with her husband, who's from Tunisia, and has worked locally with nonprofits serving immigrant and refugee populations, and their dog Mago and their cat Bobby. Without further ado, please welcome Brenna Boyd.
Hello, thank you so much for that intro, Zainab, and also for the privilege of being able to speak with you today. I have a little intro slide with some pictures as well. As mentioned, I am a current grad student, and duplicates my kind of background here. And there you can see a picture of Mago. On the left, in the middle, that's me and my husband Wadia, and my sister-in-law Amal and my nephew Yusuf. On a very snowy day, we got to see them over the holidays, and then Wadia with Bobby, our cat, who either Bobby or Mago may come in and interrupt at some point if they get hungry. So I did want to start out by seeing if somebody would want to share with me kind of just general interest level, general knowledge of science, of medicine, of genetics. Some people know a lot, some people hate science, some people think it's cool. I didn't know if anybody would be willing to tell me kind of their general interest level and also knowledge level.
Do you mean of all three, or each, like just
any of the above?
Well, genetics, I know kind of it looks at your DNA information, and so information from your DNA to kind of see if you have if you're predisposed to having certain illnesses or diseases that run in your family. And I think the three overlap, honestly, but yeah.
Yeah, they definitely do. And so kind of, building on that, my goals for today, what I would hope is that, I can teach you a bit about genetics, a bit about genetic counseling, answer any specific questions you have. And I really hope if you have questions at any point, feel free to jump in, interrupt me, or raise a hand. But if I miss it, just speak up. If anything is unclear, please let me know. I also hope that, if you were to be referred to a genetic counselor or to a geneticist, that some of the information I provide can help to empower you for those appointments, so that you kind of know some things about what to expect and what kind of questions that you might be asked. And and also some of your rights, the rights that you have going into an appointment with either a geneticist or a genetic counselor, and just feel a little more prepared for that, and have a little more understanding of why a referral might take place. And then hopefully it'll be interesting and kind of fun for you to learn a bit as well. And so I was wondering if anybody has any specific questions. I thought right off the bat, I'd just see if anybody has anything, burning questions about genetics, about, genetic medicine or genetic disorders at all. I always want to know if people have, specific things that they want to know at the beginning. And if not, I can kind of jump in and if questions arise, I'm definitely ready for those. So not seeing any immediate questions. Oh, and I do see in the chat that people are very interested in that science is not my favorite, but knowing a bit about genetics, enjoying learning. Yeah. So I'll also add to my bio that I didn't know anything about genetics until I was in my early 30s and working in a job in a psychology lab that was studying autism and working with families that had kids with autism spectrum disorder, and doing that looking at it from a genetic standpoint. And that was when I first started learning more about genetics and really feeling interested about it. Yeah, and I did get a question in the chat of what's the benefit of pregnant moms doing genetic testing, and that's something I'm going to talk about. I have a couple of slides on that of the different types of testing that might be suggested to you during a pregnancy, and the kind of information that you could find out, and hopefully some information about, whether or not that would make sense for you. I don't feel strongly that everybody should do anything. I think it's a really personal decision. And I think that doing, any sort of testing should be a very, a personal decision about what makes the most sense for you and for your family. So yeah, I'll definitely talk about, some of the prenatal testing that you can do and what you could find out. So yeah, I'm excited. That's a question. So genetics in general is the study of DNA and study of our genes. So DNA, it's kind of like the recipe for making people what they are. So it's telling your body how to grow and how to develop and how to kind of put everything together, right? And so the study of medical genetics is kind of studying when things go wrong. And we don't need to get into too much nitty gritty on this, but it can be helpful to think of that, your body is made up of cells, and inside each cell, it contains your chromosomes, and the chromosomes are these little packets that have a lot of DNA inside of them. And so you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And that's why that company is called 23andMe. If you've heard of that one, that's why there's 23 pairs. And so a gene is kind of a segment of DNA that makes kind of a protein product. And proteins, we think of them sometimes, for our food, but everything is made up of proteins, and proteins are not just kind of the building blocks of what we are, but proteins also are kind of the instructions as well. So they'll have, different, like, hormones are also protein products as well. So thinking a little bit more, kind of fun fact about DNA, if you were to take that DNA that in the last slide was kind of all wound up really tight inside one cell, and you totally put it all the way end to end, it would be 6 feet long, which is like the height of a refrigerator. So that's in just one cell. So there's about 37 trillion cells in a person's body. So if you were to unravel all of the DNA in a human body, it would be as long as 37 trillion refrigerators. So that's like going back and forth to the sun 61 times. It is a lot of material, but again, it's kind of replicated, same information for the most part in your cells, and then kind of broken down into these pieces. So another way of kind of thinking about it is that chromosomes are kind of like that it's like an instruction book for everything that happens in our bodies. If you think about all the DNA, the chromosomes would be each one of the chapters, and that you kind of get one copy from your mother, one copy from your father, and the genes are like the sentences. And then when we have changes in our genetic information, people sometimes call them mutations. It's like a spelling change. And so you can think about it that it could be something where it changes the meaning. And so you end up getting something different is happening. So that would be like this sentence here, like, it's different to say a gray cat ran down the hall than ran down the ball. But there are some spelling differences that don't change the meaning, like how the letter gray can be spelled with an EY or an AY. It's a difference, but it doesn't really matter. And so we can have a lot of different changes to DNA, and a fair amount of them aren't going to do anything. So having a change is not necessarily bad. Everybody has changes in their DNA. It is just a common process. It's something that happens. Generally, it's not.
Hita ulit. Hanggang ulit ang hitam.
Brenna, on that last slide,
Yeah.
when would you say, or what percentage is considered in the DNA? I guess for it to really make a difference.
What percentage of the time is there kind of a difference that is impactful?
Yes.
No,
It's hard to say. So if it is like, when you're if I were to go back to this slide where you see these letters here, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but where you see kind of the letters here, if it's a change and it impacts just one of those, often it doesn't make a difference.
Okay.
And if there is a difference, it's not a very big one.
Mm-hmm.
Where you tend to have a bigger impact is sometimes you'll have things that will make a whole chunk disappear, or a whole chunk will be duplicated.
Yes.
And the bigger the magnitude of that change, the more likely it is that it's going to have an impact.
An impact. Got it. Okay. Thank you.
And that goes all the way up to thinking about, I'm going to talk a little bit about like Down syndrome, trisomy 21, where you have a whole extra chromosome, and that impacts, but there's a lot of variability, and obviously a lot of people who do have that whole extra chromosome live wonderful lives. And are not super impacted. So it's not necessarily like a really big impact.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me see, get back to where I was. So thinking about genetic counselors specifically, we are specialists. We provide some personalized care for genetic health, and it's really a combination of providing education, providing some medical care, and doing counseling. And so some of the services that we provide, we try and empower with information. We do a lot of providing emotional support, because it can be difficult to either think about testing or to think about or to kind of adjust to the results that you might receive. Also helping people to understand risks. Oftentimes when there is a disease or a medical condition in the family, people are interested in knowing how likely it is that either they or one of their children will be affected by that. And so we help with kind of calculating what that probability might look like. Then we try and help connect people to other services, to support groups, to, family support, to financial assistance, whatever the needs might be, we try and help support in that way. And there are a lot of different specialties. Prenatal is a big area of genetic counseling. So that would be thinking about, some of the different anomalies, like having fetal anomalies. So that could be things like cleft lip, cleft palate, having club feet, having spina bifida, a bunch of different differences. Thinking about Down syndrome, thinking about things that are qualified as being a high risk pregnancy. That can be kind of subjective. Some genetic counselors work in neurology, so thinking about things like muscular dystrophies, which are kind of losing strength over the lifespan. Other diseases are Huntington or ALS. ENT stands for ear, nose, throat. So these can be different, like hearing conditions that can be genetic, different vision conditions that can be genetic. There's a lot with cardiology and thinking about heart health. A lot of different things with kids, thinking about developmental delay, autism, thinking about seizures, and also what's called dysmorphic features, which is basically just when there's kids look different in a distinctive way that might be suggestive of something else going on. A lot of people work in research that's kind of expanding and trying to figure out how to do better services, provide better care, and kind of expanding that, working in public health. And then some people also work in industry, so working in like commercial and genetic testing companies. And, I think when I've thought about this, that I feel like a lot of the services of a genetic counselor really kind of overlap with those of a doula, and where it can be complementary in some ways. And there were some doulas that actually spoke at our national conference this year, but really providing a kind of a specialized care and being an expert in supporting people at a particular time in their life, and assisting with navigating a personal situation. There can be medical involvement, being that source of support, source of expertise, and connection to other services and support. So I love all the areas that doulas are working in now, and really appreciate doula work. And so, yeah, was excited to kind of think about ways in which I think that's kind of complementary to genetic testing. And so, in terms of educating people, we do a lot of other stuff too. We're like I said, providing emotional support, providing a support system, thinking about some, different cultural and social differences and what supports people could appreciate. And really thinking about, for people, I think that people think a lot about what would happen if they do testing and it comes back positive, but they don't always think quite as much about what would I do if it comes back negative. There still is uncertainty that remains. So trying to help people think through some of those things. And so then thinking about some reasons that people might see a genetic counselor. So your doctor could refer you to a genetic counselor. You could also ask for a referral. And these are some reasons that you might want to talk to a genetic counselor. So if you are pregnant or considering pregnancy and you have questions about any genetic risks to the baby, if you or a child that you have or another family member has been diagnosed with a genetic condition, or there's concern for a genetic condition, and sometimes that means you're thinking about things that run in the family, or that you've heard of that a family member has, or if you or your child or a family member have some like unexplained medical concerns that could be due to genetic causes. So this could be, a wide range of things. Couple things it might include is infertility, having, kind of a long-term infertility, having multiple miscarriages, having a family or a personal history of kind of the same type of cancer or similar cancers kind of showing up multiple times, or also of like heart disorders or blood disorders. These are some of the type of things that sometimes motivate people to think about, if they would like to talk to a genetic counselor.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sorry for the interruption. Genetic counseling for infertility, I never made that association. So that's something new that I'm learning. I always thought like they look at sperm count and, they, what the woman takes tests, but that's really interesting. Wow.
Yeah. And I think that also a lot of times with infertility, at least in, I think in general culture, people focus a lot more on moms. And I think that, in genetic counseling, we think a lot about both parents and think about seeing if we can identify something that could be contributing.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's a certain type of genetic change that is actually, I think it is like, might be the primary cause of male infertility.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it is something to definitely think about.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, some just common things that may have a genetic component. And what I mean by, I'll get into this a little bit more, but these are not things that it's like DNA is not destiny. If you have a certain change, and I think that's important to keep in mind too, that if there is a genetic change that's identified, it doesn't mean you're doomed or like, that you're definitely going to get a condition, but there is a genetic component, a part to cancer, to heart disease, to diabetes, especially the kind that's the childhood onset kind, to having strokes, and also to having Alzheimer's disease. And one thing we think about, this has some like annoying big words like multifactorial causation, but I do like the model that when we think about something like cancer, like if you think about something like lung cancer, for example, if you think about having these like marbles in a jar, that there can be a genetic component to causing cancer. And so you fill a jar up a certain amount of the way, right? And then there's environmental factors you can put on top of that. So that could be, living in a place for lung cancer. It could be like living in a place that doesn't have clean air, that has a lot of pollution. It could be smoking. It could be all sorts of other things that kind of add up on top of any kind of underlying amount of risk that you have. And then it could get to a point where it kind of tips to where you end up developing a condition. And that's what we mean when we talk about there being like both a genetic contribution and an environmental contribution, that you can have a predisposition, but then there can be these other factors that also really do make a difference. And so you do, to some extent, there's control. There's control over some of those factors. For sure. I did want to pause because that was a fair amount of like science things. If anybody has any questions at this point. Not, I can kind of keep talking a little bit more about. So what might happen if you get referred to a genetic counselor for any of those kind of general reasons? A genetic counselor is going to ask about family health history and discuss any genetic risks. So going to probably draw a big picture of your family tree and want to know about, different diagnoses that people have had and how old they were. It can be a lot of questions, and sometimes people feel bad if they don't know all the answers, and it's totally understandable. And I know that there's also a lot of differences in how much families talk about things and talk about health. I know, for example, in my husband's family, they don't talk about cancer in particular. You don't want to voice it into being, so it's just the bad thing. And so there can be a lot of uncertainty in families about health history, and that's totally understandable. And so, I think that in appointments, just to know that people might want to ask questions, and whatever that's great. You don't need to, it's understandable if you don't know more. Also, to kind of talk about what genetic testing might be offered. Offer continued support through that testing process if anything is recommended, if you do decide to do any testing. Help with making sure there's insurance coverage, and kind of if there are follow-up steps in terms of any medical management following testing. That's another thing that we would be helping with. And yeah, really fundamentally helping you to understand when and if to pursue testing. Again, if you go in for a visit, it is helpful to have any family health history. You don't need like medical records, but if you can have one sent over from prior doctors for yourself, that can be helpful. If you've had any prior genetic tests, having the results is very helpful. Then really having a list of any questions and concerns that you have. I will say also that sometimes there can be a long wait to see genetic counselors, especially at Seattle Children's Hospital. There's a very long wait to get in. So just letting you know that it's not as difficult for prenatal. It's not as difficult for adults, but specifically for kids, it can be a long wait. And some of your rights, if you were to see a geneticist or genetic counselor, you have the right to take your time making a decision. You don't have to make any decisions that day. You can consult anyone you want before deciding about testing. You can decide not to do testing or to do it at a later date. I feel very happy when I feel that people make an informed decision that it's not the right time for them to do testing. I think that I think it's as important for people to recognize when it's not appropriate. And I think that there can be, in our society, there's so much medicine sometimes, and there's so much encouragement to do testing and to do interventions. And I think that recognizing when it's maybe not the right moment, and to feel good about that and feel supported in that is really important. And of course, you always have a right, if you want or need it, or if your partner does, to have an interpreter, family navigator, social worker present for any appointments, always. Thinking about costs, insurance, if you're referred by another provider, it should be covered by insurance. Testing is usually covered by many insurances, depending on what it is and what it's for. Hospitals and providers will also help with learning about coverage to make sure you don't end up with, with a charge that you weren't expecting. I will say that sometimes, based on results of genetic testing, there can be like other follow-up things that are recommended, and those are not always covered. So that's one of the things that we try and think through before deciding on any testing. So thinking about kind of pros and cons of genetic testing. Pros are, finding an answer if you have specific questions, and that sometimes it gives you kind of steps to take and, what to do next. Specifically thinking about some of the things with like cancer. If you know that there that there is like a genetic change or a mutation that you have that means that you're higher risk. Sometimes that means that your insurance, well, that always means that your insurance will allow you to do more screening so that you can catch things before they develop. So for example, if you have a family history where people got breast cancer at a young age, normally insurance won't cover mammograms until you're 40. If you have certain genetic variants, you can have mammograms younger, and that means you can kind of change that story in your family of people getting diagnosed at a young age. So that is a potential benefit. In terms of kind of cons, we don't know everything. There's a lot we still don't know. There's more information coming out all the time, but we definitely don't know everything. And there's a lot of test results that are returned that are called variants of uncertain significance. And that means that we don't know what this genetic change does. And we will tell you if that classification changes, but really we can't tell you at this time. And sometimes that, for some people, they don't want that uncertainty. That's too much for them. It's too much worry. So wanted to make sure again that I don't have any questions popping up anywhere. All right. So thinking about some of the reasons that people are referred for genetic counseling when they are pregnant. So a few things. Mom's age, there's just these totally arbitrary cutoffs that medicine has decided on. And so if somebody is pregnant with just one baby, they're 35 years or older at the time of delivery, they get referred for genetic counseling usually now. If you're pregnant with twins and you're 33 or older, you'll be referred for genetic counseling. Doesn't mean you have to accept it, but you'll be referred. If parents are related to each other, so if they are cousins, second cousins, third cousins, if there have been any differences that have been identified on first or second trimester screening, so that's some of the blood testing that is often done by an obstetrician. If there's been any exposure to what's called a teratogen, which are things, there's some medications that are known to impact pregnancies, and then also some like illnesses. So like rubella is one that I know can have impacts on pregnancies. If someone has a history of having multiple miscarriages, or either partner has a known family history. And then also if you have done what's called carrier screening, and there's any positive carrier screen. And I'll talk about that a bit more, but one thing I did want to mention too is just kind of a note about when parents are related to one another, thinking about like how closely related it is. That's kind of what we think about. It is not necessarily bad. It does not, people tend to, there can be a cultural judgment about it, I think, sometimes in the US, or thinking that it is bad or that it causes issues, and it doesn't. It doesn't until it's really close, like siblings. And this is why, just to kind of explain why it's something that we think about in genetics. So we think about, there are certain conditions that the way that they go through families is that if your parent has it, you basically have a 50% chance of getting a condition. So these are things where you have like a known family history. So again, thinking about susceptibility to breast cancer is one, or thinking there's certain blood disorders too that they're just like fairly common. Sickle cell anemia would be another example. But there's other ones that are that what it's called is recessive. And in order to be affected, in order to actually have symptoms, both parents have to have this genetic change. So this picture shows when one parent has the genetic change. So half of this dad's kids will also have the change, half will not, and nobody in this family is going to show any symptoms of this medical condition. However, if both parents are carriers, if they both have a genetic change, then 1 out of 4 of their kids are going to, each child is going to have a 25% chance basically of being affected, of having symptoms of the medical condition. And some of these are, some of these types of conditions are they're very severe. And so these are ones that then 50% of their kids also will be carriers. So this is things like cystic fibrosis is one that is maybe more common that you may have heard of. Most of the conditions that are on the newborn screening, which is the thing at birth where there's kind of a heel prick that they do with kind of a needle and take a little bit of blood. Those are testing mostly for these kind of recessive conditions. And so what the relationship is with parents being more closely related is that these things across a population, they can be incredibly rare. You know, they can be 1 in a million or something. But the more close relationships that you have within a group of people or within a country, the more you kind of end up having overlapping DNA, basically. And so it makes it more likely that 2 people would both be carriers. And so it makes it more likely that they might have a child who would be affected. So again, this is nothing where parents are causing anything. It's not their fault. And also, you know, being related does not in and of itself cause medical problems. It just increases the likelihood that one of these things, that both parents would have it. And everybody's a carrier for something. Everybody's a carrier for a lot of things, actually. So if you've been offered carrier screening in any of your pregnancies, one of the cautions that I always say with that is that the more conditions that you test for, the more likely it is that you'll find out that you're a carrier for something. So if you do a test for like 500 different conditions, most people will be a carrier for like 3 things on that test. And that really freaks some people out. Understandably. It doesn't, you know, I think the doctors always say like, it doesn't matter unless both parents are carriers for the same thing, which is true, but also just knowing that you're a carrier can be stressful, can be really stressful for people. And I do have, so I have kind of this slide about, you know, some of the prenatal screening, some of the prenatal testing. So thinking about screening, really important to keep in mind that it's not diagnostic, which means that you shouldn't make any decisions based on it. I kind of think of prenatal screening as being like, you know, the metal detectors in the airport. Like, sure, it'll catch if you have a knife, but it'll also catch if you just forgot your keys in your pocket. You know, they kind of, they have a high error rate, which is why you have to follow up with other testing, because they're just kind of flagging things that look off. So ultrasounds are technically screening. If you do ultrasounds, they're looking, and sometimes they'll see things that look a little off. And if you've ever had that happen, usually the doctor will say, let's come back and do another scan in a few weeks and just see, maybe it was just the angle we were looking at, maybe it's not actually seeing something. The carrier screening that I was talking about, where you can test a parent to see if they're carrier for any of those recessive conditions, that is also same thing. That is screening. There's some other blood tests that we do early in pregnancy sometimes, and that is often, looking for things that would be an indicator of like Down syndrome or other kind of chromosome differences. More and more often now, they're recommending that people do what's called it's called cell-free DNA, or it's called non-invasive prenatal testing. Those are kind of the two different terms. It's the exact same thing. And what it's basically doing is it takes a blood sample from mom, and it's getting a sample of the maternal DNA and the fetal DNA, the baby's DNA that is circulating in your blood all the time. Which is cool. And it's really cool to be able to do that off of just doing a blood sample just of mom. They're doing this a lot now because you can find out the baby's sex from this. It also usually is looking at some of the big chromosome differences like Down syndrome. And you can decide if you want to add other things on. It is very accurate for looking at the baby's sex, and it is very accurate for looking at like Down syndrome and some of the other things where you have a whole extra chromosome. It's not perfect though. And so I would want to emphasize that, that it's definitely not perfect. And that if differences were found, they usually recommend that you do some follow-up diagnostic testing. I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions. Feel free to either voice them or put them in chat, either public or just me. If there's any questions about those types of screening, either the parental screening, the carrier screening I mentioned, or this cell-free testing.
Yeah, I was wondering about like what the doctors are basing their genetic when they say there's an abnormality. I guess, do they have something from the parents or from that person on profile, or is it just general what they see in the human population and what they know of from DNA and chromosomal structures?
Yeah, so it is looking just at the reference population, and so this would be only looking at really big differences. So it's looking at things like having an extra entire chromosome or having big pieces missing. And so when you're thinking about, even for like how it's looking at the sex of the baby, it's not actually counting like, so X and Y are what matters for determining the baby's sex, and they're just looking for if there is or isn't a Y. That's all they're looking at. They're not counting how many of each there is. So yeah, they're just saying there's supposed to be, 2 of all the chromosomes, and then either having 2 X's or having an X and a Y. Yeah. So then thinking about the actual testing, so this is diagnostic. So these are things that people can make decisions based on. This includes kind of the 2 things we think about mostly are chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis. And then also there can be cord blood testing that can be done at birth. These used to have a much higher rate of miscarriage associated with them than they do now. And the reason that it's not very high anymore is because now they use an ultrasound during it, but there still is a risk. And it's up to people to decide if that risk is something that they're comfortable with or not. I think it's completely your decision. So chorionic villus sampling, this is basically taking a sample from the placenta specifically and sampling those cells. And as you can see in this picture, it's using an ultrasound to guide it, but it is a needle going through the belly, which again, a lot of people very understandably feel uncomfortable with and not pleasant. So, you know, I try not to ever lie to people. I don't think it's pleasant at all. And amniocentesis, you do that farther along in pregnancy. So the CVS, the last slide, you could do that earlier. You can do that at like 10 to 14 weeks. Amniocentesis, you have to wait until a bit later, at least week 16. And this is taking a sample of the amniotic fluid. And so those are two different ways that you're getting an actual, you know, an actual sample of the genetic material. And so you can do diagnostic testing in that way. So if there are differences found on like that cell-free testing that I mentioned earlier, sometimes people will recommend, they'll say, you know, you can do diagnostic testing, but basically if you don't have to, it's just if you want to know while you're pregnant, because you can also wait and then do testing at birth for anything. So no harm in that way. And yes, so there was the question in the chat, the risks of genetic testing. So, I mean, so there's the risk of doing this diagnostic testing for an amniocentesis. The risk of miscarriage is about 1 in 400. The risk of miscarriage with the CVS, the prior slide, is less than that. It's lower risk than that. I think when I think about the risks of genetic testing, though, the main risks I think about is finding out information that you weren't expecting and that changes things for you. You know, either it changes the way you see yourself or your future or the way you live your life. You know, I think that oftentimes people feel like finding out more information is just a good thing. And I think that in our world, we're so used to wanting information and wanting more information, and we think it's automatically better. And I think that's not true for everybody. I think, you know, sometimes it causes more stress. In terms of the question of is there a reason why doctors would recommend to do an amniocentesis if a genetic test doesn't show anything? No, you wouldn't do an amniocentesis unless there was already a strong suspicion of something of an abnormality. It could be based off of ultrasound. Like if you had ultrasound and it looked like, for example, if it looked like there were really big differences in like the baby's, how the baby was growing in some ways, there are things that wouldn't have been picked up on prenatal screening for that. And you can do more testing when you have a sample of amniotic fluid than you can with like the cell-free, just because you can get more detail than you can using the sample from mom's blood. So if there are, you know, concerns based on some of that imaging, that would be a reason. And then the question of like, can chromosomal abnormalities be corrected if learned ahead of time? Usually no. Usually there's nothing you can do. There are some, so you can't, there are some very limited conditions that you can do prenatal treatments for now. And there are definitely some conditions that if you know that your child is going to have them, there are treatments or special diets or things that you can start at birth, and that will make a really, really big difference in terms of outcome. So one condition I think of is, this is on newborn screening, but it's called PKU. And if a child has, it basically is a difference in how your body uses proteins, and a body has a hard time digesting certain things, using certain proteins. And if somebody doesn't know that a child has PKU, the child over the lifespan ends up with a very severe intellectual disability. If they're on a certain diet from when they're a baby that restricts the proteins that are hard for them to kind of digest and use, they're not affected. They're totally fine. It's not an easy diet, but that's the kind of thing I think about. So you can't change their genetics necessarily, but you can prevent the genetics from having a bad impact. There are more trials happening now with like sickle cell anemia in particular. There are now gene therapies that are starting to be used that do change. They change the shape of those cells. That's like still on a kind of a research basis, but there are things that there are starting to be more things, but I'd say by and large, most of those chromosome abnormalities can't be changed ahead of time. Some, but most no. So just kind of, thinking about it again, some of the reasons that somebody would do genetic counseling for a newborn or for an infant. So there's that newborn screen that is kind of the heel prick test, where they just put someone on like a piece of paper. If there's an abnormal result on that, they'll want to confirm it. Or if there are any differences on test results, if parents have a known condition. And then if doctors notice certain differences, so this could be like different facial features, different body features, differences in muscle strength. Sometimes it can be things if like a baby is like has really, really tight muscles, or if they're like really, really loose muscles. There's kind of those extremes. Doctors pay attention to that. And then thinking about these like metabolic disorders, some of the things that doctors would think about would be having seizures, having a lot of vomiting. There's some that are associated with very distinctive body odors as well. So these are kind of some of the things that the doctors think about. And then thinking about like, something that people do know often are familiar with Down syndrome, trisomy 21. This is something that is commonly tested for. And I have a picture, so just to kind of have a picture of what we're looking at. So chromosomes don't always line up really pretty like this, but this is what it would look like. These are actually the photographs. So they would take a photograph of the chromosomes inside a cell, and then somebody makes them all line up. But this would be it's down the middle bottom there. You can see those 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. And so otherwise there's just 2 of each one, and that's what causes all of the differences that you observe with Down syndrome. And then I know we're getting close to time. I do have, some things that people would think about for, I have just a couple more I can touch on really quick, but some of the reasons that for kids get referred for genetic counseling, or families get referred for autism or having any sort of developmental disorder, having some distinctive unusual behaviors. So these could be, some very repetitive behaviors, or sometimes it can be a very fixed interest on certain things. If there's intellectual disability or a developmental disorder that can't be explained by anything else. Unusual growth patterns. So this could be a thing if like if their head is really large for their body, or if a certain part of their body is growing and it's not the same as the rest of the body. So if like one side of their body is growing a lot more than the other side, that can be genetic. Also, if they're short, if they have like they're just not growing in general, or if their arms or legs are short for their body, also having differences in vision. I think I've kind of already talked about cancer some, but these are some of the cancers that have a high probability of being genetic, or higher probability. So breast, ovarian, colorectal, uterine, pancreas, gastric cancers, and endocrine cancers. We always think about this more too. Are there other people in the family? How old? When people are diagnosed young, we worry a little bit more. And especially if they have like multiple different cancers, or childhood onset cancers. And then finally, thinking for adults, if there is any sort of, recognized or known genetic syndrome, a significant family history of medical or psychiatric conditions can have a genetic component. Some strange, different like skin findings. So it can be like striping, like kind of stripe marks on certain parts of the body, or having areas of skin that are a lot darker or a lot lighter than the surrounding area. Albinism, being an albino, is genetic. Having blood clotting disorders as well, and then any progressive muscle weakness can be genetic. And it's always worth asking. And I think that also when I think about, I know this is a mom's group, and but taking care of kids means taking care of yourself as well, and taking care of your own health. And so always worth it to ask, right? And if people, I know we're up against time, but if people have follow-up questions for me, I'm willing to take them now, and I'll also put my email, my contact information into the chat, and I'm very happy to, answer questions afterwards as well. Yeah, so I can talk about, somebody asked about talking about PKU as it relates to genetic screening. So PKU is something that is on the newborn screen. And so it's something that all kids in Washington are tested for at birth. And I'm pretty sure it's in every single state in the US at this point, because the impact is pretty severe. It has that recessive inheritance, the pictures that I showed, where both parents need to be affected in order for it to show up. And it's something where kids are not going to seem necessarily very different at birth. They're going to seem totally normal at birth. And you want to start, if they were to have it, you would want to start treatments within the first few months, weeks to months of life. And it's something that you would not necessarily know that you had a family, that it was in your family. That's the tricky thing with the recessive conditions, is that they can just hide really in families for a really long time, since you need both parents to have it. So that's something that also would be on the carrier screening. Sorry, that's my dog. Mako, get out. So it would be on parental carrier screening as well. PKU is also something that is more common in certain populations in certain parts of the world. And I cannot say off the top of my head where in particular, but yeah, more common in certain areas. Let me know if that does or does not answer your question, or if you have more specific questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was good. I was wondering if you could, for those for those people who don't know what PKU is, what exactly is it?
Yeah, it stands for phenylketonuria, and so it is a metabolic disorder is the classification. And so it's basically that if somebody has PKU, their body is not processing certain enzymes in the right way. There's an enzyme deficiency. I'm not an expert in PKU, and so I'm trying to remember the actual like chemistry of it, but basically your body can't process, it's missing, that's what it is. It's missing an enzyme that it needs to process certain proteins. And so you just can't eat those because you end up accumulating a lot of a waste product in your cells since your body can't get rid of them. And then it ends up damaging cells. And so it damages cells and then eventually ends up damaging, it hurts brain development eventually, PKU as a disorder. And when you say like, how is it collected? Do you mean the test? How is the like test collected? There was a question in the chat, I think from Faiza.
Oops, yeah. I mean how it's collected, since it's collected at birth.
Yeah.
You know, just a procedure, because for some people it might not, they might, you know what I mean, with the name and all that stuff, it might not ring a bell, but
Yeah, so they probably wouldn't talk to you about like this specific disorder, but for the newborn screen, it's, so what they do is if a baby's born in a hospital, they come in at birth and they will poke the heel and put a little bit of blood on a card on a piece of paper. And then they use that in Washington to test for like 50, I think it's over 50 different conditions, and PKU is one of them. That I kind of used as an example. So yeah, so that's what the newborn screen is. I can see if I can find a picture of that card, but that's something that they do for like, yeah, for all babies born in hospitals. And then if I think at birthing centers as well. And then if you do a home birth, it's usually something that I think will be mentioned or recommended. They really do try to get babies in for doing this newborn screen because there's not thought to be a lot of downside to it. Because it's one where it's very, you know, these are very, very rare conditions, but if you find them out, everything that's on newborn screening, there's a treatment available for it. Yeah, okay. That's what I thought, but I was like, needed to think about it for the home birth midwives. They do them as well. Yeah. And that is important to know about the newborn screening, that those are only conditions where there is a treatment, and they know that if you start that treatment or the diet or whatever it is early in life, that it will make a big difference in terms of outcomes. So yeah, so genetic testing for autism. So autism, there is a big genetic component. One thing I didn't really talk about in this presentation, but genetic can mean running in the family. It can also mean a change that occurs that is not inherited. So Down syndrome is an example of that. It is a change to the DNA, but it is not something that is running through the family. It's just a change that occurs. So with autism, there are, I think there's hundreds of genes that have been identified at this point that are related. I would still say that for most people who have a kid with autism, and this is true with intellectual disability, this is true for developmental delay, and it's true honestly for cancer too, that not getting to have a negative result, to not get an answer from genetic testing is more likely. It's more likely that you won't get a answer from genetic testing. So that's important to know. But But autism does have a really significant genetic component, particularly if there are, multiple kids that are diagnosed in a family, or multiple family members. What the doctor would probably recommend if they thought that it made sense to do testing. And at this point, I think it is pretty broadly being offered. They would offer what's called a panel test, which means there would be one blood sample, or a spit in a tube, or you can kind of wipe the inside of the cheek with it's like a Q-tip. And then they would test for all those genes with just that one sample. And yeah, so that's what that would look like. I can't say exactly what the probability of getting a positive result from that would be. And it usually won't change treatment, but it can be really helpful just to kind of know, to have a reason, I think. And then for certain, so there's some kind of subtypes basically of autism, where there's also epilepsy, where people have seizures too, or kids have seizures too. And sometimes there are specific treatments for those ones in particular. And I would say epilepsy is an area where there's a lot more genetic testing being done now, and can make a huge difference. Because there are more treatments that are kind of tailored, that are emerging or being developed now. It's a big area of research. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm kind of in a lot of loudness of my children around, so I didn't want to get off mute, but thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem at all. And yeah, if you have anybody has follow-up questions about anything, I'm happy to do my best to answer them.
Yeah, Brenna, just wondering how, I guess how significant is, as those shows you talked about, 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. When it comes to race, how accurate are those things?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So if you're white, they're more accurate, honestly. What they're looking at is they're also looking at who is in a place now. So they're telling you, usually, if they were to say that I was, I don't know, German or something, which I'm not, but it would be because I have a lot of genetic similarity to people who are living in Germany now. It depends on how many people have participated in doing those. So if it is something you're interested in doing, I would say, one, do it for fun. And just keep in mind, if it says something that doesn't agree with your understanding of where your family is from, don't let it change, your identity. But I think that, it still can, add information that you don't know, and can connect people in a lot of ways. But it does depend a lot on who has done it from the part of the world that you're from, basically. And the more people that are from, the part of the world that you think your ancestors are from, the more likely that you're going to get accurate results. I would also say that the health information for those, for 23andMe and Ancestry, I would not trust them. They have a really high false positive rate. So if they tell you that you have a susceptibility for a disease or something, there's a really good chance they're wrong. And then on the flip side, they're only looking at a few genes that are associated with each condition, and those are usually ones that are associated with a condition in white people. So if you're not white and you get a result that is like totally negative, that says they didn't find anything, I wouldn't trust that it would completely rule things out if it's something that you're worried about, for example.
Yeah, those things are interesting because sometimes you get like you're, 1% white or like you're 1% German, like you said, or Chinese. So they're kind of the interesting test results. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, my husband did the ancestry thing for fun, and I mean it seemed reasonably accurate to like
Mhm.
where people in Tunisia generally have ancestry, but there was one part of it too that I can't remember how it was categorized, but there was something about like Peru, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that like I never met. I lived there. I never met anybody from Peru. Never met anybody from Peru. It was like real random.
Wow.
So we didn't put a
Yeah.
lot of stock in that, but
Yeah. Yep.
but
And
everything
there,
else, I mean, it seemed broadly, it seemed pretty accurate. I was saying that he was
Yeah.
North African and probably had like some ancestry from Spain, and then some from the Middle East. So
yeah. And then there's that show also, Finding Your Roots. I really like that show. So I'm assuming that they're more like their stuff is a lot more spot on, or of where they have all these other records in addition to like the DNA that they use to.
that makes a huge difference. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's what's hard too, though, is that not everybody has all those records and has that
Yeah.
knowledge. And like, best
Yeah.
case scenario, you can put all those pieces together, right? But if you don't have all of that, I mean, I think it's a reasonable starting place, especially if you look at it as something that's going to be interesting and fun, but not expecting it to like be like concrete identity, basically.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we got to that question. Can you please describe genetic testing for autism? Oh, I think we answered that one, right?
Yeah, I did get that.
Yeah.
I think I caught the other ones too as they were coming through, but yeah, like I said, I think did I put my email in? Yeah. If anybody has any questions for me at any point, always happy. There's no such thing as like a weird question, a dumb question, anything like that. I like talking about this stuff, and yeah, I think it's always helpful, and I think that genetics is really confusing. And I think anything that can make it easier to navigate is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If no one else has any questions, I have one last question. I'm wondering, Brenna, can you talk to like disparities in genetic testing referrals for women, particularly for women of color, when you look at things like breast cancer?
Yeah. So there's definitely there's a lot of disparities. I think there's a lot of different layers to it. I think that one thing is just access to care in the first place, and then also what I think that there's a lot less preventative care sometimes that people are getting that is really necessary, and so people are not necessarily getting those referrals. And then I think that there's racism in what doctors talk about. So I think that there are things that, like historically, like with cystic fibrosis, for example, it was thought of as like a white Jewish disorder. And so there are stories I have heard from 10 or 15 years ago and stuff, but where like it's not as common in the Black population, but of like Black kids having a really hard time getting an accurate diagnosis because doctors were just not seeing it, because they were like, no, it's like a white Jewish thing, which it's not. It's it's in every population, but just that kind of having that blindness to seeing things accurately, and that has really changed. One of the big differences in the last few years with a lot of the disease screening is that we're not doing things by ancestry anymore. We're just doing it. We're just doing the screening for everybody the same way because it's more accurate that way. But yeah, I think that in no way does that mean that there's not still super significant disparities, and there's a lot of people working on it, and I think that there's still a super long way to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that, it's good to have family information and to be empowered, but there's also still a part where I think that providers don't always listen as well as they should.
Absolutely.
Don't hear people. And I don't think that people should have to be as fierce of advocates for themselves as they often have to. But I also would encourage that, that, fight for yourself if you feel it's warranted. And yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any more comments or questions, guys? This was so much so interesting today. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
great. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your great questions. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, feel free to reach out at any point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brenna. This is really good. And thank you everyone for being here and for all your great questions. Yeah, and for I mentioned in the chat box, but we will be changing the times that we meet, so we'll keep you guys apprised of that for our upcoming meetings. Yeah. Thank you so much again, you guys. Thanks, Brenna. Have a good night.
Everybody take care.
Bye. Bye.